In the two most consequential U.S. presidential elections after the 9/11 attacks, the blood sacrifice of two fallen soldiers named Khan occupied the symbolic center of nationalist myth-making. In using the label myth to interpret the meaning and function of stories about fallen Muslim American soldiers, I do not mean to argue that such narratives are in any way empirically false. The mythic Muslim soldiers that are discussed here were real people, but narratives of their sacrifice were appropriated and transformed in a public discourse about the meaning of communal belonging and national identity in the post-9/11 era. These U.S. Muslim military members became mythic, that is, superhuman, as their blood was imagined to be an almost magical elixir that could redeem the nation. Democratic politicians and their surrogates conjured images of these soldiers' graves and memories of their lives in order to renew the myth of a liberal, multicultural consensus, and in so doing position the Democratic candidates as the most authentic practitioners of a faith in a religiously tolerant American nation. This chapter of the book that we're all writing together argues that the deaths of Corporal Karim Khan and Captain Humayun Khan in the Iraq War of 2003 were cast as symbolic blood sacrifices that sanctified U.S. military intervention in the Muslim world and transformed America into a polity that could literally incorporate Muslim bodies. It shows how the myth of the fallen Muslim American soldier relied upon placing Muslim American service members in some of the most meaningful rituals and spaces of American civil religion. The chapter concludes by analyzing the limits of its success, as some critics challenged the authenticity of such narratives, while others disagreed with the underlying premise that Muslims could or should be incorporated into the nation. On October 19, 2008, a little over a fortnight before the November 4th election contested by Democrat Barack Obama and Republican John McCain, former Republican Secretary of State and retired chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Colin Powell, appeared on the NBC News Sunday morning program Meet the Press to endorse the Democrat. Powell outlined multiple reasons for his choice, many of which were driven by sober policy concerns and a sense of which person was better suited for the job. But there was also a push factor behind his choice. He had grown weary of anti-Muslim rhetoric in the GOP and attempts to tarnish Obama as a Muslim. Powell pointed out that Obama was a Christian, but in perhaps the most dramatic moment of the interview, he asked rhetorically, "What if he is? Is there something wrong with being a Muslim in this country?" The answer is no, that's not America. Is there something wrong with some 7-year-old Muslim American kid believing that he or she should be president? The reason for his dramatic declamation on this point was, he said, because of a powerful image. It was a photograph of Karim Khan's mother at her son's gravestone in Arlington National Cemetery. Powell continued, "And as the picture focused in, you could see the writing on the headstone, and it gave his awards, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, showed that he died in Iraq, gave his date of birth, his date of death. He was 20 years old, and then at the very top of this headstone, it didn't have a Christian cross. It didn't have the Star of David. It had a crescent and a star of the Islamic faith. And his name was Karim Rashad Sultan Khan, and he was an American. He was born in New Jersey. He was 14 years old at the time of the 9/11 attacks, and he waited until he can go serve his country, and he gave his life." This image of a mother at her son's grave spoke to former General Powell's deepest values as a patriot and his most fervent hopes for his nation. Now, as numerous scholars of religion and nationalism have argued, the willingness of citizens to sacrifice their own blood for the nation and for parents to sacrifice the blood of their children might be considered the ultimate act of religious piety in the modern world. World War I poet Wilfred Owen called it the old lie and mocked it, but also recognized the power of this act of national devotion. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. How sweet and fitting it is to die for one's nation or fatherland. Carolyn Marvin and David Ingle have asserted that the sacrifice of one's life, the shedding of one's blood, is the, quote, holiest ritual of the nation state. In the past, Christians may have been willing to die for their faith, they opine, but in the modern world, the God of the nation state has replaced the God of Christianity as the ultimate basis for communal formation and social agency. Agnieszka Monet riffs on this idea, stating that, quote, while many people have abandoned religious beliefs and practices, it is almost impossible to have no nationality. Even people who have lost their citizenship one way or another usually consider themselves as belonging to some nation, in at least a spiritual and cultural sense. This is not to say that other forms of communal formation and social belonging have disappeared in the modern world. Transnational ties of confessional religion, ethnicity, politics, race, global economic interests exist alongside the nation state, sometimes even challenging its hegemony. But these imagined affiliations are just as apt to accommodate, or in the case of capitalism, reify the nation state as the most powerful institution of human community making. This is true even in the case of Islamist political formation, which is sometimes thought to be the most significant challenge to the nation state in the contemporary world, but more often than not supports and sustains nation building. In the end, according to Monet, quote, nationality is generally the first and most important way that social life on this planet is organized. In the election of 2008, America's most respected military man made the case on national television that the blood sacrifice of a Muslim American soldier for the nation was particularly meaningful in an era of anti-Muslim prejudice. His advocacy for the inclusion of Muslims in the U.S. nationalist myth echoed his own role in the military history of the United States. As the first African-American officer to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Powell signified the promise that America's military could embody, represent, and even heal a nation of many races and ethnicities. Analyzing Powell's role in the first Gulf War during 1990 and 1991, Melanie McAllister argues that Powell became the nation's premier citizen soldier, the living embodiment of the institution in which the whole nation must recognize itself. Liberals and conservatives alike lauded Powell's performance both during and after the war. Few questioned his role in embodying and praising a multicultural vision of the United States that was tied inextricably to military intervention on a scale unprecedented since the U.S. loss in Vietnam. Powell's eulogy of Karim Khan echoed his own symbolic meaning to American nationalism. In praising Khan, Powell was doing more than including Muslims in a liberal and multicultural vision of the U.S. nation state, just as his own presence meant more than having a racially integrated military force. Powell was also justifying, indeed sanctifying, wars in Muslim-majority lands as a part of the myth of American exceptionalism. Khan's outsider status as a Muslim, the fact that he was fighting as a Muslim against other Muslims, signified the religious importance of America's mission in the 21st century. Powell made the point that it was Muslims who now renewed the myth of American exceptionalism, a myth that was rooted in the 1600s Massachusetts Bay Colony, where Puritans articulated the idea first that they were chosen by God to occupy the land. Now, left unsaid in Powell's remarks, but essential to the making of Karim Khan into a mythical figure, was the gendered nature of this image. One of the primary reasons why Powell noticed the photograph at all was the presence of Khan's mother, Elshiva Khan. You see in the photograph her eyes are closed, her left arm is stretched across the top of the gravestone. She rests her head on her left arm as she uses her right arm to hold on to her son's gravestone. It was a reenactment, according to Ji Young-um, of the Pietà, Michelangelo's sculpture in St. Peter's Basilica that depicts Mary, the mother of Jesus, embracing her dead son. Like the Virgin Mary of the original Pietà, argues, she sacrificed her son without protest, calmly accepting her role in the larger narrative of collective national suffering and the redemptive figure, the son, the soldier, who would die in the place of others so that they would be saved, unquote. Points out that Elsheba Khan's ethnic and racial identity is perhaps understated in the black and white photograph, but that Pao, the embodiment of multicultural liberalism, makes it clear that Khan and his family are part of the larger narrative of multicultural sacrifice for the nation. It must also be said that her religious identity as a Muslim is ambiguous until Pao makes it legible. Elsheba Khan is clearly a maternal figure, and her serenity embodies the sacrifice of Mother Mary. But unlike Mary and some Muslim American women, she does not wear a veil. This stereotyped material sign of Muslim femininity is absent, and it is Pao who makes it clear to his non-Muslim audience that she is mother of a Muslim son. The setting, Arlington National Cemetery, was also important to Pao's interpretation of the photograph. His allusion to the presence of an Islamic star and crescent on the gravestone and its implied nearness to the symbols of a Christian cross and the Jewish Star of David established a solemn setting for his vision of a multicultural America. The crescent and the star proved that Muslims could be loyal to the United States, challenging the idea popular among some American voters that Muslims are inherently anti-American. And this is exactly what Karim Khan had yearned for. Growing up in New Jersey, so close to the fallen towers of 9/11, Khan had vowed as a child to show the world that, quote, not all Muslims were fanatics, and many like him were willing to lay down their lives for the country. This was no empty promise on Khan's part. As a high school freshman, he registered for Air Force Junior ROTC, but he ended up enlisting in the U.S. Army once he graduated from Southern Regional High School in 2005. For 20-year-old Karim Khan, military service was a way to prove that he belonged in and to America. It offered what Monet calls the promise of unassailable national credentials. Ji Young-um adds that such service has an intimate connection to formal citizenship as well as symbolic citizenship. As observes, military service often expedited pathways to citizenship after 9/11 as the U.S. military sought to recruit native Arabic speakers and other linguists. And as I show in my new book, Muslims in Americans in the Military, this has been happening since World War I, as the military service is a pathway to citizenship. As Karim Khan knew, however, the ultimate sacrifice was, the ultimate proof of belonging to the nation is the willingness to die in battle, and in turn to, quote, kill others for the sake of its self-preservation. These were his two favorite movies that he watched while he was stationed in Iraq. I don't have time to analyze the movies, but because I want to just briefly mention the part of the chapter that discusses Captain Humayun Khan and his importance to the election of 2016, which Mujahid already very nicely laid out. Let me just add a couple remarks, and then I'll conclude about this. Let me remind you that as the 2016 campaign transitioned from the summer convention to the fall debates, an increasing number of Muslim American critics called out Hillary Clinton for seeing Muslims only in light of their value to national security. In all three debates, Clinton framed Muslim Americans as, quote, our eyes and ears on our front lines, leading writer Ismet Saramangla to declare that, quote, her framing of Muslims solely in terms of national security has an insidious effect in continuing to stigmatize them as something less than fully American. Finally, activists like Linda Sarsour, writer Hussein Rashid, and others tweeted about this, but maybe the best line was St. Louis Post-Dispatch columnist Aisha Sultan, who said, it's weird how politicians keep telling me I'm on the front line of fighting terrorism when I'm just trying to get through a sugar detox. Now, this sarcasm and the more sober criticisms exposed the limits of Hillary Clinton's myth-making. I'll summarize this since I'm short on time. Another critic of the Khan story was someone who worked for Breitbart News, and this critic made the case that it was Hillary Clinton's vote in the U.S. Senate for the Iraq War that had sent the Khan's son to his death. For Hillary Clinton, of course, this was not a bad death. This was a good death. It renewed the nation. It was the blood spilt that was necessary for incorporating Muslims into the nation. But this is something that what Junaid referred to yesterday as the Muslim left became highly critical of throughout the fall as Clinton continued to pound the idea that Muslims were only valuable insofar as, or they were valuable insofar as they were important to national security. We don't have time to talk about whether in the end the myth worked, okay? But let me just come to this conclusion. By the way, there's a part of the paper that looks at Dwight Eisenhower and the liberal multicultural consensus that I don't have to talk about since Kambiz already spoke about. But there's Ike at the Islamic Center in D.C. in what was it, 57 or 8? 57, yeah. They never, even though throughout the fall these ads, these very emotional ads kept running, and I believe that they ran in Michigan as well, in basically all the battleground Midwestern states. It's a minute-long ad, and it ends with Khizr Khan with tears in his eyes, mourning his son. The question is, did this work? So one conclusion is it didn't. And scholars of religion and violence have offered several theories for why the myth of blood sacrifice fails to work, especially how it fails to unify a country. In the case not only of Humayun Khan, but also of Karim Khan, and all those Muslims who have served in the U.S. military since the Revolutionary War, attempts to make myth around the fallen Muslim soldier have gained in popularity since 9/11, but have not been successful vehicles for the establishment of an authoritative, multicultural, liberal consensus touted by Colin Powell and Hillary Clinton. Because the country is at war in Muslim lands, and because half the country believes it is at war with Islamic religion, it may be that Muslims will continue to serve as the symbols in and on and through which the nation is contested and created. For some, the detention, surveillance, torture, and killing of Muslim bodies is the price paid for liberty. For other Americans, including Muslim Americans, such horrors betray American ideals. In that context, the deaths of Muslim military members can have limited symbolic utility as the nation remains divided over the question of who must and can be sacrificed for its unity.